Welcome to the Campus Multiplication Network podcast. I'm Paul Worcester with my co-host Gary Stidham, and the goal, as always, with these podcasts is to be laser focused on collegiate ministry, reaching, discipling, and mobilizing college students. And so today we have an awesome opportunity to have AJ and Karen on, and AJ wrote a little ebook called Giving Up Control. They're from Australia, which is really cool. We get to hear that in their accents in a second. But taking on in this Giving Up Control ebook is all about how he shifted from a staff centric model of collegiate ministry to a more actually a pretty radically student led ministry on his campuses. And so Gary and I recently both read that book, and we were kind of texting back and forth. And we were like, we got to get this guy on the podcast. And so we're so excited to. It's been a little bit of we're all in different parts of the world. So, but here we are, finally getting on the podcast. So thanks for joining us, AJ and Karen.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Paul.
AJ and Karen, it's so good to have you. I would love for you just to give our people who are listening a little background on yourself. Just tell us about yourself, whatever you want to about your personal and ministry journey.
Yeah, sure. It's a pleasure to join you guys. Yeah, so I'm from Australia. Grew up around Sydney, and I became a Christian just before going to university. And when I got to uni, I got involved in the campus ministry there, and that was really key time for my spiritual journey. Just getting like intentionally discipled and invested into. I think, yeah, I was really blessed by the staff and my campus, which just gave me opportunities to lead and the freedom to fail and try stuff. And really, I think my personal calling to ministry happened halfway through my degree. I went on a short-term mission trip to the Middle East. And during that trip, I was just like really shocked to discover that like the people there, I was the first Christian any of the students I met on campus had ever met. And it really hit me towards the end of that short-term mission trip that I was probably also going to be the last Christian any of these guys were ever going to meet. And
Wow.
I think from that, I just thought like, wow, you know, what really matters in life is so different to what I'd been focusing on as my life direction. And I just really strongly felt God's call into ministry from that point. And yeah, so I got involved in campus ministry in Australia for many years, and that's where I met my lovely wife, Karen, who's joining us today. And yeah, it's just been a real adventure, a real ride together.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's so great. I'm so glad that you guys are both on here. And the subtitle of your book is a little intriguing. And you notice I have my hat that says revival, if anyone's watching the video. But the tagline of the book, Giving Up Control, is why movements are preferable to revivals. And so I thought it would be a little bit fun to wear the revival hat because I'm a big fan of revival, but I'm also a huge fan of movements. And I would actually agree with your statement. So before you jump into, but go ahead and let us know, why did you pick that subtitle, and kind of how would you define a movement in contrast to a revival?
Yeah, I mean, I think revivals are, amazing works of the Holy Spirit. Just to be clear on the record that I'm not against revivals, but I think, anyone who's involved in ministry, you're like, what are we really hoping and praying for? And often we'll gravitate to revivals. But what struck me is when you study, a number of revivals, historical revivals, some of them were real just flash in the pan, like there was this amazing effect, but then it just petered out to nothing.
Mhm.
Some led into what they call spiritual movements, but not all of them. And I think it's spiritual movements, which is something which perpetuates, something which multiplies into the lives of others, which is actually much more desirable for those of us who are seeking to see God move on our campuses.
Yeah, very cool. AJ, I know from your story that you guys were leading a team doing collegiate ministry in Sydney. And by all accounts, it was a successful ministry. You guys were reaching students, you had a core team, you had leaders, but over time you felt a burden to shift your ministry model. Could you tell us what that effort looked like at first, like what that ministry looked like at first, and then why you started to question traditional ministry approaches?
Yeah, it's probably best to start just with why we decided to shift. Um, I was very much, I drank the Kool-Aid of our organization, which was like, reach the campus today, reach the world tomorrow. And this concept of, that we will multiply into others and it'll just continue to multiply. But I found that when I looked at our ministry, the size of the ministry, the number of students we had coming to faith, the number of students involved in our Bible study groups was directly proportionate to the number of staff we had on our staff team. And so early days, we grew our staff team and we saw the ministry grow. And then we had some of our staff sent to East Asia and our ministry shrunk again. And I thought, this isn't right. And when we started to look at our discipleship trees, we'd have a first generation, a second generation of disciples, but it was dying out at that level and it wasn't becoming like a really fruitful fig tree where at the end you just have like these really stunning green leaves, but rather it was like something where the further you went out, the more you just ended up with twigs and no fruit. And I kind of realized I'm pouring, my blood, sweat, and tears into this, but I think this is something's not going right. And so that was really, I think, the start of the journey for questioning the way we were doing things. But the key pivot point for me was actually some experiences my wife had.
Yeah, do you want to share, Karen? You want to share kind of how you played into all that?
Yeah, so I actually stumbled upon some of these concepts by accident completely during my new staff training. So I was given a project where I had to pick a subculture on campus and then try some ministry strategies out on that subculture and then write a report about it, which sounds pretty straightforward. And that was my project for one semester. So I decided to pick international students. And I was told very strictly by my boss, yes, he was my boss at the time,
Yeah, that's convenient.
that I know that I was only allowed to do 4 hours a week on this project. So I was only able to spend 4 hours a week reaching international students. And so I think that just highlighted to me this was completely impossible for me to do anything substantial in 4 hours a week to reach this group. That just seemed completely ridiculous. And so I thought, well, how am I going to do this? So I thought, well, maybe I do know two international students, a guy and a girl, and maybe I'll just train them up in the basic tools of like an evangelistic Bible study and then a follow-up Bible study and some of those basic building blocks that we've seen work really well with international students and other students and just skill them in those basic tools. And so I just basically went around and I did some ministry with international students, but I did it very much with the point of view of, okay, guys, I really want you guys to learn from me so that you can do it next semester. And then maybe...
Which was largely motivated by the restrictions which were placed on you, wasn't it?
Exactly. It was because of the 4 hour limit, because I thought, there's no way I'm going to get anything done in 4 hours if I don't train up some other people to help me. And I just need helpers. That's what I was thinking. So I started training these guys up, and then it just went wildly better than I think any of us ever anticipated. They got some skills and they got some apprentices of their own, and they started training up their apprentices. and they became believers. And then all of a sudden we had this movement taking shape, and this thing had a life of its own, and I didn't know what to do with it.
I remember visiting it once, and it's like you probably had like, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 people in a room. You had like an Arabic guy who was leading one Bible study, Chinese over here. You had like every nationality
Yeah,
represented.
I think it was about 60 people at that point, and it was starting to get close to the size of some of our other mainstream things. And
Seriously,
it
it
hadn't
was.
even been going for that long at that point. And I didn't know, I was started to freak out a little bit because I wasn't prepared for this. But at the same time, from an objective point of view, it made us all think, actually,
Mm,
this is really interesting.
mm.
What's happened here?
And we had the summer holidays coming up, and we'd really wanted to have, over the summer holidays, we'll have international students arrive to our university early so they could just work on their English. They'd got academically accepted to the university, but their English was borderline. So it's like if you come half a semester early, you can work on your English. And there's no one else on campus. So we'd learned this was a great way to do outreach to internationals on our campus. They're looking for campus life, but there's no one there. If you turn up and do activities, they're super open to joining a Bible study and just, anything. But our organization said, we've got no staff available to, commit to your campus this summer. So
For a summer mission.
yeah, so there'll be no summer mission. And we were really frustrated by that because we're just like, oh, it's such a wasted opportunity.
And we've had all of this momentum with this international ministry happening.
So I think we talked about what Karen's experience had been, and we said as a campus team, what if we just challenged the students to run a mission without us?
Like, do we really need staff to run a summer mission? Look how well they've done without us, with very minimal input with just the day-to-day ministry in the international ministry.
Yeah, and so that just went incredibly well. We challenged about 10 of our students who were not going to go on any mission because they had to be at home over the summer for this or that reason. And they had zero equipping from us. And we just said, well, you guys organize yourselves and have a good time. And we came back and they had seen, I can't remember, it was about a dozen people come to faith that grew so much through the experience of having to lead by themselves. And so we just thought to ourselves, what are we doing as staff? Like, are we actually even getting in the way of the students, which is a radical thought. And that was really the point at which we said, maybe we should just flip the whole ministry to being catalytic, where we are getting the students to lead things and we redefine what is our role as staff.
Yes. So I remember we debriefed the students from that and we asked, do we just get in the way? Is there any point in us being here? And they said, no, actually, we really felt we wish that you guys were here to advise us on this and that. And that was when we really started to get together some of the basic concepts of, okay, this is the role that staff can most helpfully play.
Yeah. We're like, okay, so you're saying that you are better off with staff, but you can kind of see we're just going right back to ground zero and saying, okay, well, tell us how, in your perspective, do staff play an important role?
And that was really how we kind of got started with the model, to be honest.
I love that. So you use that term catalytic ministry, and maybe that's a common kind of terminology in your organization, but would you kind of define what that means? And then, yeah, go ahead and jump into what did you see are some of the key roles that staff do play in a catalytic ministry?
Yeah, sure. The term catalytic, it originally comes from chemistry. So a catalyst is something that if you've got potential energy locked in a compound of some sort, even like, if you have a candle, you put a flame to it, that just releases the energy that's stored in the wax. And so the basic idea of catalytic is, instead of you being the main one injecting energy into a ministry, you're looking for Christians who are already in place on that campus and looking at how can we play a role to enable them to reach their full potential. So that's where the name comes from.
Yeah.
Yeah, what would you say, Karen?
Yeah, it's really basically seeing how we can enable and equip Christian students on campus to reach their full potential and do pretty much everything that we would do ourselves.
What are some of the roles that we play as staff in a catalytic mindset? I think one of them is being an institutional memory. So students only stick around for 3 to 4 years. So they're great at innovating. They're insiders for the current generation culture, unlike us. So they come up with, fantastic insights. But they come and they graduate and they go. And I think one thing you can do as staff is you're around where you can hear their ideas and you can be a feedback mechanism and say, yeah, you can go down that route, but you can also waste a lot of time doing that. That's not going to be very fruitful. If they get stuck on something, you can say, well, one model I've seen students do on this other campus or your campus did several years ago was X, Y, Z. And so you can be the elder, kind of like the wise institutional memory to the movement.
Yeah, it sounds like a big shift is from the staff doing most of the direct ministry to students to the
Yeah.
staff really empowering a select few students, and they're the ones doing the direct ministry
Yeah.
to the students. I imagine I'm thinking about we had phases in my campus ministry journey where we were more staff heavy and more student empowerment
Hmm.
focused. But I imagine there's a lot of people listening and their ministry, it's really is a staff run ministry. But the thought of shifting and maybe staff even pulling back from doing direct evangelism quite as much or leading all the Bible studies, that's a really scary thought for a lot of college ministers, especially if things are going well. If it's not going well, you don't have as much to lose, but if it's going well, it's scary. Would you
Mm.
maybe walk us through the story of how you made that transition, some of the nuts and bolts of it? I think one concept that was really helpful in your book was the idea of a J curve, that it may not
Mhm.
instantly start going well, but it might go well over time. Tell us what the transition looked like practically in your campus ministry.
Yeah, J curve's like a concept that we were taught when we first joined campus staff. So it's the phenomenon when you have a team that's planting something new on a campus. So you've got no Christian students to disciple yet. Uh, and so you spend all your time doing evangelism, for example. You're going to see a lot of evangelistic fruit because you're putting a lot of energy into that. But then as you have people become Christians, and you start engaging more of your time into discipleship of these young Christians, which means you're going to do less evangelism. You got less hours to do that. And so you'll see your evangelistic fruit drop off. But the idea is that, this is a short-term investment for a long-term benefit because that generation of disciples is then going to mature and they'll be doing evangelism themselves. And so you'll kind of rocket out of that dip in the J curve to greater heights than you were able to achieve when it was just your staff team doing it in the first place. Under a staffed model, where staff-led, the problem was we just weren't seeing that slingshot out of the J curve. There was something that was just limiting the amount of ownership and zeal to the students, which we couldn't work out how to overcome. But Catalytic seemed to really unlock that for us because I think the difference was with Catalytic, you say to the students, this campus is yours, and this campus is yours to reach. And my team is willing to come in and mentor you and coach you and teach you skills, but we're not going to reach this campus for you.
I do. I will say though that transition was scary.
Oh,
So
maybe. Yeah.
I remember the staff meeting when we decided to do it. Honestly, it felt like we were jumping off a cliff, and we were not sure whether we were going to fly or whether we would crash. But I think we'd all prayed about it and we felt convinced that this was the way to go. And so we all drove off the cliff together. But I mean,
It took nerves of steel.
It took nerves of steel. And part of it was we prayed about it and felt like this was the right way to go. But to be completely honest, part of it was also AJ's burnout. I think you'd gone through a big burnout and you had just run out of energy to do normal face-to-face ministry. And you just were like, I'm done. Well, let's try catalytic because I don't think I can do it the way I have been doing it. And so we just thought, well,
selfishly, there was actually a real appeal to catalytic with that, because it's like the burden of the ministry is not on my shoulders anymore. It's on the student leaders, and we're just coming in to coach, support, and mentor them.
So I sort of feel as though God had put us in a bit of a dark place, but then the advantage of that was we felt, well, we've got nothing to lose, we'll just try this. And then if it doesn't work, then I guess maybe we'll leave ministry. I don't know. But then it worked really well.
Yeah, I can really relate in some ways to your story. And my wife, our ministry was just taking off at Chico State in Northern California, we had a growing ministry. My wife got a bad back. She basically injured her back having my son, and she was stuck in her chair kind of pretty much 24/7, could get up 15, 20 minutes at a time. And as we had a growing ministry of students that we were seeing dozens come to Christ, and we were seeing like a lot of great things happen. And then we had young kids. We ended up having another kid, and it just made her back worse. I felt like, the taffy pulled in all the different directions.
Wow.
So we had to create this core team of student leaders that we basically did a similar model. We were a little bit more staff led than what you're talking about, but we really put a heavy emphasis on letting the students be the front lines of evangelism and disciple making on campus. And that became actually the tipping point where we started seeing many people come to Christ and this little mini movement of God take off on the campus. So I can really relate. Sometimes, God's power is made perfect in weakness, and sometimes He uses those limitations to help us be more innovative and more strategic. And I bet in that season, you guys prayed a lot harder too. Am I right?
So true. So true.
So sometimes it's like doing less, but praying more can actually result in greater fruitfulness. So yeah, maybe share a little more of the story and kind of how that played out, and what are some of the things that you saw God do as you were kind of stepping into that scary next step.
I remember that we started on some new campuses. That was one of the things that we did because we thought, okay, well, we're just going to plant some new campuses. That'll force us to empower the students on our old campus some more.
And make ourselves absent, wasn't it?
Yes, and make ourselves absent. And so that seemed like a great idea at the time. But then it was kind of like, well, how do we explain this to the kids? And so when we tried to explain it to them, we're going to be around less because we're starting campuses elsewhere, they were kind of like, but what did we do wrong, And so it went down like a lead balloon at first. And so that transition was a little bit rocky.
It was. It was rough. It was rough to explain it to the students and then not take it as a rejection. It's interesting because we had two campuses. We had, the one campus we've been staff leading for many years. And then there was a second campus, UNSW.
Which we planted, I think, at this time.
Which was already kind of running, but had not got support and was struggling. And we're like, okay, we're going to be more available to you to come in and coach you guys because you just haven't been getting any coaching. While at the same time, our Sydney University was saying we're going to be less available, and very different issues were faced by the two. So the UNSW campus, which had been purely student-led for many years, but had not done well because it had no coaching, tended towards over-dependence on us. It was like, great, we can all take a seat back because you guys are coming in, you're going to run everything. So we had to figure out how to navigate that trickiness. And then our original home campus wasn't used to stepping up with us becoming absent and really critical things like our main weekly meeting, which is, just so important for momentum and so on. None of them had stepped up to lead it for that year. And in the past, if students didn't step up for something, we're like, oh, we'll just put a staff person in charge of that and they can look out for an apprentice, when one becomes available. But we were like, if we do that, that's going to kill this transition to student-led, on day one. So we're like, we cannot step in. We have to be willing to let this fall if the students don't step up themselves. And so we had to communicate to the students like, okay, none of you have stepped up to lead this. Just a heads up, if you don't want to have a main meeting anymore, that's fine. The ministry is yours from now on. We will support you in whatever you want to do, but just a heads up, you don't have anyone running this.
And it took a crisis before I think they realized that. So when they realized that, okay, we're going to have to cancel the main weekly meeting, which was a highlight for them all because no one was ready to run it, they suddenly realized, oh,
You're like seriously not going to step in and
Wow.
do this.
so one of the girls said, okay, well, I'll run it. I mean, I didn't realize it was like a crisis, but I'll do it, And so, but that was actually a real turning point where I think they started to realize, okay, we can step up and we need to step up. And actually, if we run this
is what it looks like for students to be responsible to run things.
And actually it went pretty well after that, but it took actually us being willing to let it die. And a couple of things did die, but they were less important things. And that was just part of the ministry, I guess, adjusting to being student-led.
Yeah, but it really took nerves of steel. Our team was very nervous, and many times people said, should we quit this experiment and just step in, because we saw these gaps which weren't being filled.
But we just had to be willing to let things die. And then as a result, we just went through a period of growth. And all of a sudden, I think within 2 or 3 semesters, we had, I think, 5 different campus movements going. It was just from 1 to 5. It was just amazing. And it was just spreading.
And students from one campus going into the other campus to help teach them how to do stuff.
So it wasn't even just us anymore going to different campuses, planting things. I think they were looking at our example and thinking, oh, I could do that too. So it was just unleashing energy that we never even imagined was possible.
It's a really interesting insight that those 2 campuses, the reaction to the change was very different. The more staff-directed campus, you really had to work hard to let them realize, no, it really is yours. Yeah. And then the campus that you had less involvement with and you started to do more coaching and training, they were in some ways ready to just say, oh, thank goodness we can let you do everything now. So it was it sounds like a very delicate balance in that transition you were having to strike.
Yeah, we really had to, I think, figure out some, I don't know what you call them, mantras or maxims, which would guide us, like little proverbs. And so we came up with a couple of things, and they're in the book, which was so important to be like these little guiding North Stars to us. So one of them was like, never lead except to train. So it's like, when is it okay for us to do evangelism or to lead a Bible study group on campus? Well, if the students haven't been trained how to do it, then that's okay. And we're doing it so that we can be training a student. If there's not a student apprentice available to train, we're not going to do it. And there just won't be Bible studies yet on that campus or whatever, So that was one which was really helpful.
And then the opposite extreme, don't overwater the plant. So if I guess
if they're not applying what you've taught them so far, don't keep investing more theology or skills, just give what they're willing to start applying in their lives. And
yes, because people need skills, but they also need space to grow. And if you never give them space, they'll never sort of get to the next level. And that's something that we really learned.
Yeah.
Well, here's personally, sometimes I learn more from my mistakes in ministry than I learn from my successes. Sometimes I realize I run into a wall and I realize I don't need to keep doing that. Um, I- when you made this transition, things started going really well, but what were some of the maybe the false starts or some of the mistakes that you made in this transition? What did you learn about trust? Maybe learning to trust student leadership too quickly or not learning to trust it enough? What were some of the hurdles or mistakes as you made this transition?
I remember two things really standing out. So one thing was just assuming that if it's student led, that it's going to be great, you know. But yeah, realizing if a student hasn't been trained for a role and they haven't been equipped for it, they're just going to flounder, you
Yeah.
know. And you're actually not setting them for up for success by expecting them to do it. You're setting them up for failure. And so we chucked a few people in the deep end and saw them flounder and realized actually we're really not serving them by doing that. We really need to train people up for these roles and model what we're wanting them to do first, and then ask them to do it. So that was a really big learning thing for us. And I think another thing was, yeah, the right people for really particularly high responsibility roles.
Right.
So I remember, in that larger staffed campus, it was quite a big ministry, and no one wanted to take over finances. And then there was this guy who put up his hand, and everyone was kind of thinking, oh, should he really take it on? And he was an absolute disaster.
Yeah.
And we realized we possibly should have said something, or this was maybe our role at the meeting to be able to sort of say, would anyone else like to consider the role, so it doesn't mean
think
no
in a-
involvement.
Yeah, in a desperation, just to have any student take a role, and particularly if you have a too rosy romantic view of, if anything is student led, therefore it's wonderful, and this is the ideal catalytic, that can be dangerous.
It
Like,
can. So
the scriptures have standards for leaders. A
mm,
lot of them are, the criteria when you look at, Timothy and Titus, it's around character more than it's around ministry skills. And that's probably where we had the biggest issues, is when we had leaders who didn't have the right character, they did a lot of harm to the ministry.
yes. So I think we realized
I'd say that's another role of us as staff, wasn't it? It was actually to be the shepherd sometimes, to step in, and when a student leader's doing harm to, I remember there was one guy, he was quite toxic to a number of women in the ministry, and we stepped in and we stepped him down. And that was hard because he was super engaged in the ministry on one metric,
and he was very
super
charismatic,
fruitful, very charismatic. Yeah.
very gifted, charismatic in the gifted sense of the word. Like, it was just people loved him, but then there was this very dark side to him that not everyone saw, where he was stalking one or two of the girls in the ministry, and he was not repentant, and yeah, AJ had to step him down, and that we realized that was part of the role. Just sometimes being on staff is to kick heads when necessary.
Right. Right. That's really good.
Yeah, that's really important to have that balance there. And you kind of alluded to this, but kind of maybe double click on it. There is that tension of equipping and empowering, and making sure that we're empowering people well. So you even talk about the MAWL acrostic: model, assist, watch, and leave. Anything else, any tips you'd give our listeners on how to equip well, but without controlling, to empower them in the same vein?
I just want to give credit where credit's due. And I think, the MAWL acronym, which we leaned on very heavily and features prominently in our book, came from the Southern Baptist church planting movement. So I read that in David Garrison's book years ago.
Yeah.
And that was key, I think, for us to unraveling that riddle of okay, we want to be empowering students and not doing it ourselves, but we also don't want to be expecting them to do anything we haven't trained them first. And that's just on the surface seems to be a paradox.
Yeah, but it's also highly practical, and it's actually something you see in Jesus' life.
Hmm.
He never asked his disciples to do anything which he did not first model himself. And
Mhm.
uh, and that's something that I think I tell people when they're worried about, catalytic, meaning that you'll never get to do face-to-face ministry anymore. Because yeah, I think, yeah, of course you will. It just means that when you do it in order to teach. So yeah, that's something I think I really discovered in the international ministry.
Yeah, more model, assist, watch, and leave. And when we talked to our fellow staff on other campuses about what we were doing, and we talked about more, they didn't have problems with the model, assist, and even watch. But oh boy,
Leave was very
very
controversial.
controversial, and there was all kind of variations which were made of it. But I mean, you've got to understand how that can be interpreted in our context. And leave, can just mean, okay, we've got students running this aspect of the ministry, so we'll focus on the aspects they don't have, or we look at start opening up new campuses.
Yes.
But we've got to be willing to become irrelevant or work ourselves out of a job.
Yes,
Like,
and leave them to it,
yeah,
Well, I think always being around and being a resource, I think is useful, but I think there is definitely a time where you are leaving them to it, and I think that's important.
yeah,
Yeah, I heard about another ministry leader that changed it a little bit. They used launch instead. So they are launching them out, and it also enables you to launch out and to go to a new location. I love the picture of Jesus when he had the whole town of Capernaum right there. Everyone was looking for him, and then he went out to pray, and
yeah.
then the disciples came to him and said, "Hey, everyone's looking for you, Jesus. We got to start the first mega church. We got to do multiple services." You know what I mean? But he said, "Hey, I got to go to these other towns also, for that is why I've come to preach." And so his vision was to saturate all the villages, to go to every town and village, and that is why he came. And so us leaving or launching, whatever term you choose, enables us to go start new ministries on new campuses. And I really have a heart for these mega cities that a lot of times we have college ministries on these small college towns, especially in the States. In the United States, we have a thing called college towns, which is unusual. But in a lot of places around the world, we have these cities that have 30, 20, 50 campuses. And I was just with a guy in Japan in a mega city there, and their goal is to be catalytic in that sense, where they're trying to start multiple ministries on every campus. Their goal is to get onto all the campuses in their city, and there's no way to do that by just putting all your eggs in one basket on one campus. So you gotta empower student leaders and others to kind
Mm.
of, if you're going to keep saturating that target area. So
Yeah, I think there's lots of nuances, you can read into the leave. But what I like about the fact that Dave Garrison, chose to use that word is because of how provocative it is. Like,
mhm.
Jesus taught through um hyperbole, and that's the Hebrew way of teaching. You'd
Yeah.
leave your readers in this tension between these extremes. And I like how it just challenges us as campus workers to think about what is our role and what would it look like to remove ourselves as essential cogs at every level. We serve now in the Middle East, and our national director here challenged us once as staff because we're foreigners, expats. He said, "My vision for you guys as workers in this country is that one day you will become a whispered rumor, that
Mm.
we will become forgotten, and it will be the local Christians who rise up, who lead the church, who are the ones who are leading the charge. And if we become forgotten, if we become just a rumor, then we've done our job well.
Mm.
And I just think it's so good just to stop and sit with uh, that tension, to sit with what is our role and, what would it look like to strive towards that goal? So yeah, there's all kind of, I think, levels to what leave could be, but yeah,
Mm.
it's a good challenge.
It is. It is. AJ and Karen, one thing you said early on in this conversation that really resonated with me is that the message that you had to communicate to your students early on was the responsibility for reaching your campus
Mm,
belongs to you. Like you're the believers who God put on this campus, so you're the believers whose Great Commission responsibility to reach the campus, who own that responsibility. For me, leading students, there was always this temptation to lower the bar for student leaders because we want to have a lot of them, right? We want to attract more leaders. I want to keep, or if I've got leaders, their lives get busy. Sometimes they're junior and senior year, they're doing internships or their classes get more intense. And so there's always this temptation to lower the bar for student leaders because we think we can have more of them. But what you're saying is, if we really want to cultivate a movement, maybe I'll put it to you as a question. Why is setting high expectations and taking your hands off of it? Why is that so? That seems to be the linchpin in all of this. Why is that so important to set high expectations for your leaders and not water it down?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and it is such a challenging question because I think all of us have found ourselves in exactly the position that you're talking about, Gary. But I think one thing I found helpful was to ask myself the hard question of why is it that I'm doing this? Is it simply just to build an empire on a particular campus? And so if that's the case, then yeah, we lower the bar and we get a nice big crowd along to our events. But then what is it that we're exporting? You know, if we instead take a view that we on our campuses are like an incubator for potential church planters of the future. You know, if we'd never, for example, tolerate a lowering of standards in our Bible colleges because the stakes are just too high. Uh, but the men and women that we are exporting in our campus ministries, our college ministries, they're going to be the torchbearers of the gospel to their workplaces, to their families, their mums groups, all over our country and all over the world. And I really think that we owe it to the next generation to make sure we do a good job of training them up to thrive wherever God sends them next. And I think one of the problems with the staff-led training is it's too much of a leap when they graduate from, the campus-led, the staff-led ministry to real life. But if they have had to lead the charge on campus and they're running things, when they go to the workplace, and there's maybe one or two other Christians in the workplace, they can think, well, I can get something going here. I've done it before, you know,
You're setting them up for
for success.
lifetime ministry.
Exactly. You're making lifetime laborers.
I was really challenged. We had a church planter come talk at one of our staff conferences, and he challenged us and he said, "What are you guys doing to equip your students to plant churches wherever they move to after they graduate?" So Australia's got a lot of rural locations. It's very possible people could end up in a place where there's no church or no gospel-centered church, And I realized, yeah, I'm doing absolutely nothing. Any skills my students have to minister after university is entirely incidental and in no way intentional by how I'm investing. I'm seeing them as Christians who can join my ministry to reach the campus. And I was really cut to the heart by that challenge. And I thought, what happens if we flip the script? Because, yeah, maybe I'm not called to build the empire of our organization. Maybe I'm actually called by Jesus to invest into the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of God is much bigger. It goes beyond denomination. It goes beyond our campus ministry. It sounds obvious when you say it. It was not obvious to me at the time. And then it was like, so what if everything we do is aiming to equip them for a lifetime of ministry, and we care less about actually how much fruit, we're achieving just on the campus? That was a radical change. It really changed how we did a lot of discipleship, a lot of our training,
We
what
started
materials we used.
Exactly. We started to sort of see ourselves as more of an incubator and internship for a lifetime ministry. And so we would just try and get ministry materials that were as simple and reproducible as possible.
And public domain.
And public domain.
Because our organization had some like Bible study materials which were copyright. And graduates had in the past said, oh, could we use this in our church? And there'd been big discussions like, oh, should we let them use it or not? It's like, how backwards is this? We're teaching people to use materials which they're not going to be able to use as soon as they leave our campus ministry.
So we rewrote all of the materials that we were using so that it could fit on a bookmark that they could put in their Bibles.
Right.
And so that way they could see when we're leading something, if it's an evangelistic Bible study or a regular Bible study, they can see it's very obvious. We're just leading what's written on the bookmark, and they think, oh, that's easy. I could do that. So then they start doing it, and then their friends start doing it, and then it then just multiplies out. So we wanted our methods to be as easy and transparently easy and transferable as possible.
But I could add one more thing, like in terms of, where do you put the bar for discipleship? Like Jesus certainly did not put it low. He had a very high, some would say impossible, almost impossible bar for his disciples. And I think people rise to whatever bar you set. I heard a story I love, maybe it's apocryphal, about a high school which had a recruitment day, and they had a representative from the Air Force, the Army, and the Marines. And they had 1 hour to share between the three of them. So the Air Force recruiter got up first, and he got over enthusiastic. So he went for 25 minutes. And then they had the Army recruiter got up next, and he couldn't be outdone by the Air Force. So he went for 30 minutes. So there's only 5 minutes left of the hour, and the Marines recruiter gets up. So he's like, what am I going to do with 5 minutes? So he just paces the stage for 4 minutes and says nothing, just staring out at the arena of kids. And then the last minute he says, there is in this whole arena, perhaps just one, maybe two people here who are suitable to join the Marines. You know who you are. Come see me after. Who do you think all the students, flocked to as soon as the bell rang? And it's like, I think people want to be called to a high bar, a high vision. And
we are designed to live for a purpose greater than ourselves.
Yeah.
I love that. And I think that does inspire students towards something greater. And really, it's taking a long-term view of our ministries, not a short-term perspective. And it can be really tempting to compare with other ministries on the size of their large group meeting, or to think, oh man, when you start to see that little dip in your weekly meeting from 80 to 60, but what if your ministry at 60 is healthier than your ministry was at 80? But it doesn't feel as good, or to your supporters or your newsletter or even the students themselves, they can be really swayed by those things. But but it's important that we keep the big picture in mind, because if we don't, that may be another thing that is a staff role, is to constantly encourage the students is, hey, we're not trying to compare with other ministries. We're trying to instill this vision of spiritual multiplication into what we're doing. But let's take a kind of a case study here. Imagine there is a ministry that is a larger, healthy ministry in a lot of ways, and they have multiple staff all on one campus, maybe a college town, and they've been running kind of this staff-led playbook. What advice would you give them for kind of transitioning to a more student-led approach, and how would you advise them to get started on that?
So I think the key is you've got to have a bigger vision. So, if in that area, there are other campuses which have no presence, challenging that staff team and saying, own that whole region as what you're trying to reach, so that you just get it to a point where you're not going to reach them if you stay staff intensive.
Mhm.
I think that's the starting point.
Yes. And if it's a college town and you're the only college in town, I think a great way to get a bigger vision is just to see yourself as you're kind of like an internship for the ministry workers that you're sending out into the workforce. And so the experience that you are giving them in this internship program, is that realistic, and does it prepare them well for the workforce? Does it help them find the 2 or 3 other people that will be in their workplace? Does it help them get something new started? Does it help them get stuff off the ground and reach other people? So just asking those sorts of questions, and if the answer is maybe they're not quite there yet, thinking what would it take to get them to that, and begin with the end in mind.
Yeah. Well, I love that. I love that you guys really believe in this student empowered catalytic model. You stumbled into it in some ways because of Karen's 4-hour experiment and AJ feeling a little burned out with the model you had. But it's obvious that you guys have spent the time to really understand and believe in this model and see the fruit from it. This has been so
Mhm.
helpful. I think that's a good note to end on, guys. So I want to just take this opportunity. AJ, Karen, thank you so much. This has been so helpful. I can imagine a great number of listeners that are going to check this out and are going to make some changes in their day to day. I will give a plug for the book. It's called Giving Up Control: Why Movements Are Preferable to Revivals. We'll put a link to it in the show notes, but it is on Amazon, Kindle. I think it's on Audible. I think I saw it on Barnes and Noble, and it's available for the whopping price of 99 cents US dollars. And
That's the
it's only about
lowest
120
Kindle would let
pages.
be listed for.
And I won't tell them this, but I think you might even find a free PDF if you Google enough.
Yeah.
But it's only about 120 pages, and the appendix has all of those resources that you guys created. It's such a simple, great resource. Highly recommend. And for those of you who are listening, please hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to this podcast. It really does help people find content like this. And if this episode benefited you, please share it with a friend. That would help us out too. So thanks so much for listening, and we will see you next time.